Today on Leaf by Leaf, WARHOLIC by Alexander Theroux. Though not at the level of Darkenville's cat, WARHOLIC still has that Therouvian vocabulary, and it in no way obscures readability or comprehension. Here's a sampling for your pleasure. If you are easily offended, or the type of reader who writes off a book or even an author altogether if something rubs you the wrong way, I cannot express emphatically enough how much you should avoid this book. Personally, I can't imagine writing something like this on many levels, and I am very sensitive to differences in taste amongst readers. But those very tensions, for me, are part of the attraction to a book like this. It's not unlike rubberneckers passing by a car accident. I just can't help myself. I want to look. I'm compelled to look. I'm compelled to read. But it's also a part of me that shares the sentiment with PEN America's statement in response to the American Dirt controversy, where they said, "As defenders of freedom of expression, we categorically reject rigid rules about who has the right to tell which stories." It should also be noted that I have deliberately spent decades conditioning myself to be able to open up to authors and views that do not align with my own. In this way, I side with Yale professor Amy Hungerford, who has said that she reads not to reaffirm who she is, but to learn who she is not. I really like that position, even if she does refuse to read Infinite Jest. In this almost 900-page chronicle of American cultural life at the turn of the 21st century, in nearly all of its manifestations, we get the complexities of the Eugene I. Stone's Laura Warholic relationship, along the gonzo comic absurdism of a cast of cliché characters pushed to cartoonish limits, alongside entertaining, provocative, stimulating essays, all of which are rendered with the substantial wit, coruscating vocabulary, and keen social eye of Alexander Theroux. Oh, and the wealth of trivia in this book rivals my Ken Jennings Trivia Almanac. What more could you want? One thing that should be kept in mind is that Theroux has a penchant for striking out and drawing blood first, and then increasingly becoming more reasonable after. There is a repeated cycle of offend, defend, clarify. In a 1992 Bookworm podcast episode, for example, Theroux begins to tell a feminist joke at one point, and Michael Silverblatt hilariously tries to dissuade him from going any further. They've just said something about feminists, to which Alexander Theroux has said, "Hey, you know that joke, by the way." And Michael Silverblatt says no, in an attempt to stop the train right there. Theroux then proceeds to set up the joke, and Silverblatt talks right over him, and he says, "No, you're going to lose," which cracks me up. I've played that over and over and over. But in the end, Silverblatt cracks up at the rather benign joke, and then diplomatically smooths everything over. Theroux refuses to play by the rules, and though he is often interpreted as a mere iconoclast, or worse, I believe his expressions lend themselves more to exposing the arbitrariness of rulemaking than simply the infantilism of rule breaking. In a way, he strikes me as the Dave Chappelle of maximalist fiction in this book. Yes, when it comes to the content of WARHOLIC, it triggers just about every alarm of editorial pejorative hunting and cancel culture flagging imaginable. In fact, it pretty much makes an art form of cant and rant, and ultimately revenge, wrapped in abrasive satire, though many reviewers have failed to grasp and appreciate this tack. To treat the book solely as an offensive author's raving diatribes would be to succumb to the same fallacy as many of its earlier reviewers. It myopically overlooks the fact that there is real intelligence here, and yet another complicated relationship, a theme of his last 3 novels, which has given the exhaustive, complex analysis such relations deserve. Laura WARHOLIC, in fact, takes the biting "no one is off limits" satire of 3 wogs and the male perspective dissection of everything wrong with his female counterpart of an adultery, and pushes them beyond the limits of what some readers will be able to handle. Nonetheless, Theroux may not do what you like, but what he does do, he does very well. In terms of his refusal to play nicely with editors and publishers, this is the #1 area where Laura WARHOLIC especially has gone wrong for him. I will delay until September all the details for when I review Stephen Moore's upcoming book on Theroux, but suffice it to say that constant changes and amendments in the late stages of publishing do leave the text marred with a barrage of blemishes. Personally, I don't care so much. I'm the type of reader who can easily overlook mistakes. I see them all the time. But I do think of people like William T. Vollmann, who are also notorious for their unwillingness to make cuts. But the big difference is that Vollmann, for example, was willing to forego a large part of his advance in exchange for keeping in material for the royal family. Theroux takes the opposite approach, and this has aggravated relationships with editors and publishers. Nonetheless, now that I have given weeks of my life over to these pages, I have a slightly different view than I thought I would. I don't want any of it cut. Spelling and syntax errors corrected, yes. By all means, please replace all of those double hyphens with an M dash. And I sympathize with those who were involved in the arduous process of bringing this book to print. But I am thankful as a reader for having as much of Theroux's writing as was allowed. I don't think that it needs to be trimmed down by 200 or 300 pages, though I do understand that this would possibly make it more inviting to a larger readership. I think that's debatable. For someone like me, however, and again, I'm thankful for this hulking monstrosity in all of its vainglory. Why expunge the very excess that mirrors the excesses in thinking that constantly divide us? As Theroux writes in his poem Camera Lucida, few people have the imagination of reality. Few dare imaginatively to glimpse it as it is. Reviews. First and foremost, if you haven't read George Salis's review of Laura WARHOLIC on his website, The Kaleidoscope, please stop watching this video and go and read that immediately. In addition to being a discerning reader and incisive critical voice, Salis is a gifted creative writer and brings a prose style worthy of a Theroux review. From The New Yorker in 2007, at nearly 900 pages, this behemoth of a book seesaws between romantic meditation and frothing Jeremiad, and the relentlessly peacocking vocabulary may test the reader's patience. If you'll allow me to be sarcastic for a moment. Yes, we wouldn't want any books that test the reader's patience now, would we? Please, give us more books that read like sitcoms and TV series in prose transcription. And of course, we would never want an artist to show off their skills. We need more of that feigned self-deprecation that we have come to love so well. From the now notorious New York Times review in 2007. Set in Boston, the book has no plot to speak of. Instead, it's a vehicle for Eyestones' observations on Laura and sex. Yeah, I could see how from the title alone you would think that. I forget that for some reviewers, there is still that demand for overt, spoon-fed plot above everything else. Yet, in this case, Laura WARHOLIC does indeed have a plot, and it announces itself right from the title and the opening pages that it's sort of nothing more than what this reviewer denounces it for, that being Eyestones' observations of Laura and sex. I can't imagine what this reviewer would make of something like Musil's The Man Without Qualities. From the Town Topics in 2008. This is a great excerpt. It's sad to think of the appreciative readers who may be so put off by the novel's outrages and excesses that they give up instead of following the course of the central relationship to its stunning denouement. That would be tantamount to letting the difficulties in Ulysses and the whimsical pedophilia in Lolita obscure what's human between Leopold and Molly and Humbert and Lowe. If you read Laura Warholic with that requisite patience, you will eventually realize that you're committed to the book the way Eyestones is to Laura. And isn't that what accomplished works of fiction strive for? To implicate readers, to make them accomplices in an ongoing act of imagination. This is more humorous than anything, but from Theroux's 2009 reading from Laura Warholic at Texas State University, he opens up by reading some of his provocative poetry to the audience. This audience, primarily of college students, presumably. After which they are silent. They're stunned, most likely. Then he sort of humorously murmurs, well, it was more comic in my head. And then you can hear the relief in their laughter at that. It's almost as if he had to confirm for them it's okay to laugh at this stuff. Before reading from the controversial essay that appears in here, he tells an anecdote about how he delivered this theory in the 1970s at Radcliffe. And a woman in the audience says to him, "I'd like to stick a bread knife in you." And that ends the lecture. There's comic relief laughter to that. But after he reads it up to a certain point, he looks up and he says, "I can keep reading, or we can do some poems or Q&A." And a female audience member responds immediately, "Let's read a couple poems and move on to Q&A." In other words, that's enough for us. The video is actually really worth a watch, so you can get a sense of this character and the humor that's in there. The plot: Eugene Eyestones, a columnist known as the sexual intellectual for the Boston-based publication called Quink, gets into a relationship with his reprehensible boss's ex-wife, Laura Warholic, née Schquam. The two could not be more mismatched. Eugene is a hyper-educated individualist and recluse, acutely sensitive to all manner of human folly. Laura is, well, a mess. Forget about feral Colorado from an adultery. Laura's damaged psyche and struggle to find stability within herself far exceeds the antics of her precursor. Eugene maps his feminine ideal onto an unknown woman at a bakery whom he has never met, giving her the fairy tale name Rapunzel. People who know the mountains have a name for the radiance she gave off: alpenglow. As a friend on Goodreads put it, Rapunzel the ideal, Laura the ordeal. But as we will come to see, and as the closing sentence makes clear, this is an anti-fairy tale, a tragedy masquerading as comic absurdism. The bulk of the book is dedicated to the extreme vicissitudes of Eugene Eyestones and Laura Warholic's relationship. This provides a substrate for the elements of the book that elevate it into maximalist and encyclopedic fiction. Interpolated essays, lists, index cards that are an allusion to Nabokov's last posthumous novel, aphorisms, poems, and so on. In the end, both Eugene and Laura are disillusioned by the very objects of their ideals, and we are left with powerful statements, both in words and in actions, with which to reckon. Eugene Eyestones. Theroux, like Thomas Pynchon, never wastes a proper noun. In the Texas State reading video, he praises Pynchon for this, citing Benny Profane as one of his favorites. Eyestones has the condition of hyperopia, the opposite of myopia, which really says it all in terms of his interactions within the social fabric of America. Yet, despite this prophetic attribute, the stones of his surname bespeak obstacles in his vision. This recalls the verse Matthew 7:5. "Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye." In a sense, this is a tale of Eyestones coming to recognize the beam in his own eye, and then turning to the mote in Laura's eye, though he remains a hypocrite for much of the book. Finally, there are the allusions and references to St. Paul, who was blinded during the Damascus Road experience and talked of his poor vision in some of his epistles. Some biblical scholars believe that Paul's transformation left him physically wounded, and this is linked to the affliction Paul calls the thorn in his side in his letter to the Corinthians. Eye stones is often seen rubbing or palming his aching eyes. Aching in these moments, no doubt, because of that pesky beam. Quink. At first this put me more in a salacious frame of mind, no doubt because of the homophone of a word like kink. But upon further investigation, I found that this is the name of an actual product, a fountain pen ink from Parker Pen Company. It is a portmanteau for quick ink, which works well for a Boston-based rag at which Eye Stones writes his columns. The title, Warholic, I take to mean like alcoholic or workaholic, meaning in this sense someone addicted to war. The surname comes from the Quink editor, who was a despicable human and rendered in a comic style reminiscent of Thomas Pynchon, whose Gravity's Rainbow, by the way, hilariously and implausibly appears on a bookshelf, though Theroux does take a cheap and rather untasteful jab at Mrs. Pynchon later. The sexual intellectual of the novel is actually Eye Stones and not Laura Warhol. So why isn't the title Eugene Eye Stones, or the sexual intellectual? Possibly Theroux is showing us that they are two sides of the same coin, like some hermaphroditic Janus. Roasts. We have to be mindful to weigh the whole book instead of just focusing on the moments that jar us. For example, Laura gets her say in the end and calls out all of Eye Stone's shortcomings. Theroux, with ever the gift of the unflattering physical description, dishes it out heartily to male and female alike. And Harriet Trombone, Eye Stone's entertaining and silver-tongued firebrand neighbor from Barbados, is the mouthpiece of tirades against white European colonialism. Invectives that Eye Stones himself largely agrees with in an essay or two. But nothing is off limits for roasting in this book. Whether it's the Boston Globe, the New Yorker, people who start sentences with the word well, Red Sox fans, or tech companies, an arsenal of lingual dynamite is at the ready. Just like with an adultery, aphorisms abound. A writer who must remain in a real sense immune to experience, the better to analyze it, must also in reality be at the mercy of it. To fall in love is to have the experience of being reborn, instantly seeing yourself not for what you are, but for what you could be. A person's not what he or she does so much as what he or she is about to do. This aphorism is actually more of a Seinfeldism. What was it, Eugene wondered, with the phrase Pacific Northwest? Was there an Atlantic Northwest he hadn't heard about? Every apartment is an autobiography. Has it not often been said that the best index of a man's worth is the state of his wife's health? The controversial essay. This exemplifies what I mean by the Therouvian cycle of strike first, then defend, and finally clarify. The essay opens with the highly offensive line, "A creative woman is an oxymoron." This is then defended, and 8 pages later, we get a clarification. The expression creative woman is a tautology. Then, another 8 pages later, the opening line is explicitly retracted. A creative woman is not an oxymoron. This small example is a great lesson for approaching Theroux's oeuvre in general. You must stick with it to the end. This is your opportunity to practice not writing things off in response to knee-jerk reactions. Think of what Malcolm Gladwell was getting at in his book, Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. Furthermore, at one point, Eye Stones says, women were God's greatest creation. The controversial essay is way more nuanced than inflammatory, though, even if you don't agree with the thesis. His basic point is that because women are born with the power to create the ultimate creation, that of human life, she already overshadows anything any man, who is by definition infertile, could produce. This partially explains why there are so many doorstoppers from male artists, from male writers. They are barren and have to exert their existence through artifice. If, however, a woman attempts to create artifice, she must overcome her biology, making it even more commendable when she does it. In the next short chapter after the essay, Eye Stones gives a roll call of women artists. In many ways, this reminded me of reading Norman Mailer's The Prisoner of Sex a while back. We as readers are caught up in this balancing act between earnest sincerity and trading blows. Shenandoah. In this chapter, Eye Stones becomes a philosophical voyeur in his following and observations, always in public, of Rapunzel. In these moments, Theroux's writing is at his most sentimental and beautiful. By design, too, because the chapter brings in a meditation on why beauty and perfection always seem intertwined with sadness. It was one of those perfect, crisp fall days when rust-red and golden-dusted leaves, some turquoise, kissed by the autumn sunlight, the colors of Tiepolo's 18th century vaulted ceilings, floated from the trees, that he realized in a heart grown weary as crayon stone how much he loved her, adored her, a red-letter day memorable for being the closest Eyestones ever came to introducing himself to her. A blueberry sky, dinosaur clouds, fluffy cumulus floaters. The leaves fell to the Andante cantabile of Tchaikovsky. Bored on the 4th of July. First off, this is a great play on the title of the movie Born on the 4th of July. In the movie, a young man patriotically goes off to the Vietnam War only to become permanently paralyzed and return to an America that did not understand him. Eyestones, too, is a veteran of Vietnam, and in this essay, a harsh polemicist against democracy. But in another way, Eyestones can be seen as a paralytic who has just returned from the war of his road trip with Laura WARHOLIC. The essential thesis here in the political spectrum is that the founders of America did not have a democracy in mind, but rather a union of the few. We are now a populism, and majority means compromise, and compromise always means average in the pejorative sense. This is a theme that's also taken up in An Adultery. As with his other essays, Theroux/Eyestones brings in a litany of sources to make any research assistant feel inferior. From H.L. Mencken's quote that democracy is the art of running the circus from the monkey cage, to Robert Frost's striking aphorism that the trouble with homogenization is that no cream can go to the top, to a close reading of Alexis de Tocqueville. The essay nonetheless hits on something that we all know. Debate in democracy is interminable. It is thus the views in this essay that lend revelation to what Theroux is doing with the perverse Greek chorus of the Quink workers as comic depictions of what a democracy is like. Looking around at his fellow workers, Eyestones was convinced as usual that the tyranny of the majority was often more onerous than that of a despot. Or, more to the point, he could not tolerate crowds of any size or distinction. All groups are by definition morons, he felt. What in love or sex is not odd? Here we have a narrative essay that features a 30-page catalog of curious sexual facts, featuring such amusing treats as, whenever W.H. Auden headed into a dark tunnel by car, the poet always muttered, "Hello, mother," and "Museum silence is sexual," and Japan's employment of women who use their naked bodies as serving dishes in restaurants. Stuart Michener likened the factoids from this chapter to Lay's potato chips. You can't eat just one. Laura WARHOLIC and Eugene Eyestones. Laura becomes for Eyestones, or more appropriately, the sexual intellectual, a microcosm of everything that's wrong with America. For Eyestones, this means illiterate, uncultured, haphazard, unthinking, devoid of standards, ethics, morals, spiritually barren, and enamored with excessive consumption of commercialized ephemera. Yet at one point in the midst of his complaints about Laura, Eyestones has an epiphany. Opposites are one, he thought. Freud's darkest truism. In the center of their differences, there is then an overwhelming likeness. Both have unrealistic ideals that keep them consuming, even if the objects of that consumption are books for Eyestones and underground rock music for Laura. Two different approaches to capture that ever-fleeting aesthetic promise. Eventually, during a botched attempt at a home-cooked Thanksgiving Day meal, Laura finally gets her moment to upbraid Eyestones, who then disappears from their narrative, a rarity in the book. We now turn to Laura and her final downward spiral. At Christmas time, we reconnect with a softened, repentant Eyestones, who now fully realizes his mistreatment of Laura. The growing realization that Laura needs him as a father figure and he needs Laura as a daughter figure reaches its apex. Earlier on during their road trip, this is exemplified in a scene in a hotel room where the narrative deliberately tells us that they weren't under the covers together in bed, and he tells her a bedtime story. The counterpoise between these two is now put into sharpened contrast as Laura becomes disillusioned in the shadows of a rock concert and Eyestones becomes disillusioned in the shadows of a strip club. He is there, of course, against his will and at the behest of Laura's ex-husband, Minot Warholic, in exchange for the promise that Minot Warholic will not push a lawsuit against Laura. In this scene, Eyestones becomes momentarily blinded, just as Saul of Tarsus. And afterwards, it's as if those stones are removed from his eyes. This change of heart culminates in his attempt at a peace offering. The ending. Theroux did the same thing to me at the end of An Adultery. He brought me to the edge of all the drama I could handle as far as the tumultuous relationship goes. And then he takes a turn for tragedy with a piercing denouement and a chilling final scene. The last few chapters almost superseded the 700 or so pages that preceded. The bizarre shockorama of the Quink cast members seemed a distant dream. All of Eugene's pedanticism and Laura's flaky come-what-may slovenliness became combusted fuel for the impact of the ending. The title poem of Theroux's collection, The Lollipop Trollops, has a handful of lines that really stand out as particularly relevant to Laura Warholic. Whether read for sensuality or sense, a poem must disturb, badly reminding you, Spintry and Spintressa, of your need to be surely more than who you are. Taking the whole poem into account, art for Theroux should teach, please, and disturb us into being more than who we are.